Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's an honor to introduce Senator Sheldon Whitehouse as our keynote speaker for the annual meeting of the Medical Consortium on Climate and Health. The theme of our meeting is the medical promise of climate solutions, moving to action for health and equity. Senator Whitehouse is a leading voice for urgent action on climate change. For nearly 9 years, he took to the Senate floor each week. The Senate was in session to call on Congress to wake up to the threat of climate change. As a member of the Senate Environment and Public Works and Finance Committees, he plays a key role in crafting policies that address climate change and strengthen environmental protections. The senator is a co-founder of the Senate Climate Action Task Force to build support for action to address carbon pollution and sits on the Senate Democrat Special Committee on the Climate Crisis. He has introduced numerous pieces of climate legislation, including a bill to establish a fee on carbon to cut emissions and generate revenue to be returned from polluters to the American people. Senator Whitehouse leads a bipartisan effort in the Senate to protect our oceans. In 2011, he formed a bipartisan Senate Oceans Caucus to address pollution and commercial activity on oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes. To confront the challenge of ocean plastic and other marine debris pollution, he wrote the bipartisan Save Our Seas and Save Our Seas 2.0 Acts. Senator Whitehouse is a graduate of Yale and the University of Virginia Law School. He served as Rhode Island's U.S. Attorney General and State Attorney General before being elected to the Senate in 2016, has been reelected twice. I've met with him on several occasions over the past decade on a variety of topics. He always has the time and the interest in each of our meetings, and once even took me on a personal tour of the Senate. A few years ago, he said the Senate was divided into thirds on climate action. He said a third are on board, a third are on the fence, and a third are in denial. So as participants from around the country visit Capitol Hill, it'll be very important to hear your perspective, Senator Whitehouse, especially with the new administration that is committed to meaningful action on climate change and the Senate majority. So I'm thrilled to introduce my senator from the great state of Rhode Island, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Well, Nitin, I'm thrilled to be introduced by you. We are both coming to you from the beautiful shores of Narragansett Bay. And Nitin and I have known each other a long time and done a lot of work together on healthcare delivery system reform issues, where he has been a really important leader in Rhode Island's medical community. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I don't think I need to tell anybody about the health effects of climate change and pollution, so I'll spare you being told what you already know and go to what I think I might be more interesting about, which is what's going on in Washington in terms of getting things done on climate. And the first thing I would say is that I believe that the Biden administration got off to a very fast start. Before you have the chance to legislate, you have the chance to signal what your direction is. And I measure that with the 3 Ps: personnel, policies, and passion. And across the board, in personnel, in policies, and in passion, the Biden administration has really showed up on climate to the point where I gave up my weekly speeches. I really didn't think that anybody needed to be wakened up anymore. We needed to be got to work. And so I've stopped doing that, and we are getting to work. Legislatively, what we had hoped was that there would be a significant piece of climate legislation embedded in the infrastructure bill that was targeted to be passed by August. And we've taken a little bit of a detour, a bipartisanship detour. I don't know whether that will actually produce anything at the end of the day. I have lived the experience of, it's basically the political equivalent of Lucy holding the football for Charlie Brown in Peanuts to come and kick, and then at the last minute, pulling the football away. So Republican efforts at bipartisanship, I view with some earned skepticism, but here we are, and the president wants to give it a try, and it's his decision, and so that's what we're doing. So we're on this bipartisanship detour, and that makes it much less clear how big a role climate will have in the infrastructure bill. And it also makes it unclear whether August is still our real schedule. So a lot of stuff has been moved to where it's a little bit up in the air as to exactly what will happen when, but I don't think the underlying determination is much shaken. And I can assure you that in the Senate, there are a strong group of Senate Democrats who will be a bulwark to make sure that we get a really robust climate bill. And our target is nature's target, and that's 1.5 degrees global warming, no more. If we overshoot, we have to have the mechanisms in place to claw back so that we can put our planet onto a safe climate threshold for future generations. We've lived for tens of thousands of years as a species within a very narrow window of climate habitability and carbon dioxide concentration. And we're outside that window, and that is not a safe place to be, and we need to get back there. One of the things that has come up as we deal with the climate issue is the fact that the health issues related to climate also relate to pollution. And if we purely fix the CO2 problem and don't fix related health and pollution problems like mercury, like particulates, like coal ash, like manure lagoons, then we're leaving a lot of people who have had long-standing economic injustice behind. And it is our determination that that is not going to happen. So the group that I work with is negotiating right now with the environmental justice community to see what improvements we should have now that there's a real credible shot at getting particularly a price on carbon through Congress and turning the trajectory of our carbon emissions in the right direction so that environmental justice needs are met. The other group that we're working with that has come forward and has actually been quite helpful is the what I call the energy veterans, the former utility coal and other workers who are going to face a very challenging transition and who we need to help. It is not their personal fault that we have a climate catastrophe looming. They're not scientists, and they did a lot of good for us. They went down in coal mines where it was dangerous, where it was unpleasant, where it was really hard work, and they helped grow the American century. They helped grow the American economy to the top status of the world. And now that we know what that cost us, we have to fix it. But there's no reason to put the men and women who got us here under the bus. And so economic and environmental justice and our energy veterans are going to be a very important part of the bill that we will announce probably in 2 or 3 weeks. We have behind that coming up the Paris conference, which is actually going to be in Glasgow this year, the conference of the parties, so-called. And I think it is the Biden administration's intention, and for sure, it is Special Envoy, former Secretary of State John Kerry's intention, that the Glasgow conference really put the original Paris conference to shame, and that this be the turning point for the international community to get our arms around the climate problem and put us on that safe 1.5 degrees trajectory. Whatever gets agreed to in Glasgow, we may have to enact parts of in Congress afterwards. So the infrastructure bill on climate is not the end of the show, but it could be the most important part of what we get done, because for now, we have a House leadership that cares about climate, we have a Senate leadership that cares about climate, and we have leadership in the White House that cares about climate. And as soon as we lose one of those three, it imperils our climate solution. So time is short, the moment of this Congress is precious, and we intend to make the most of it. And John Kerry's role and the Glasgow negotiations are potentially very significant. I'll close by describing a little bit what's going on behind the scenes in the politics and why I think we aren't making clearer progress, particularly not clearer bipartisan progress on climate. And that is that America's corporate community has not stepped up on climate in Congress. We have some wonderful work being done in the corporate community in terms of cleaning up their own carbon footprint. We have a lot of really wonderful talk coming out of certain leaders of the corporate community. But the corporate community engages with Congress through a very powerful array of intermediary organizations and lobbyists. And that array of organizations and lobbyists has simply not been switched on to do anything about climate. So if you're in Congress, where the corporate rubber hits our road is in those organizations. Unfortunately, and to its shame, the fossil fuel industry continues to support climate denial and obstruction. So a part of the corporate machinery that engages with Congress is still engaged with climate denial and obstruction. And what the fossil fuel industry executives may say to the public is one thing, but what they're instructing their political apparatus to do is the exact opposite. For other companies, it's more, we're just not going to bother to raise the issue. I'll spotlight the beverage industry. Coke and Pepsi are terrific companies. They talk a great game on climate. They're trying to clean up not only their corporate footprint, but their supply chains. But the American Beverage Association, through which they lobby Congress, has not been switched on to take any interest in climate. Big tech, the monsters of Silicon Valley, they lobby us through something called TechNet, which has only been dialed up on climate just the tiniest bit. A year ago, they didn't even mention climate in their lobbying materials. Now it gets passing mention, but their focus is on tax advantages, hiring foreign engineers, protecting patents and things like that. And Wall Street, which talks a very good game and is putting pressure on other corporations, also has not dialed up its political apparatus. So at the moment, the signals that Republican members of Congress, my Republican Senate colleagues, are hearing from their corporate supporters are either deafening silence or continued opposition. And that is something that I hope will change rapidly as we move forward, perhaps even in the kind of time frame we need to deal with the August timeframe, the November Glasgow timeframe, and the response to Glasgow. So I'll leave it there for some questions, but that's our overview. I am still very optimistic about getting things done, but it's not going to be a cakewalk. It's going to be a street fight. We have the tools to win the street fight. We've got the imperative to win this, but we could still screw this up. And I hope we won't. There's a pathway to doing this right, and it's my intention to make sure that we do. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. That was excellent, and I don't see any chat questions at this point. But I'm wondering if you could comment on the Green New Deal and whether that's sort of dead at this point. Or will you take pieces of that and put it in the new legislation that will be going forward in the fall?
Yeah. So one of the things that we're not very good at as Democrats is product rollout. And the product rollout of the Green New Deal was a disaster. If you actually go through the elements of the Green New Deal, the elements are all very popular, but put together as a package, it's been a complete flop to the extent that the only person who's brought up a Green New Deal vote on the Senate floor has been Mitch McConnell, who did it to create mischief. The senators and representatives in the Democratic Party who are in purple states and districts hear about defund the police, Green New Deal, as the problems that they have to deal with. So we made a rotten job of marketing the Green New Deal. But again, people actually like the policies. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that every bill is to some degree a climate bill. And to the extent we can put things into it, we are taking the elements that comprise the Green New Deal and getting them done. Things like rebuild the grid, things like build out electronic vehicle infrastructure. So I think that the Green New Deal is going to happen quietly and without fanfare. because its policies are good policies.
Right. Yeah. And now you have a very very small margin of error there in the Senate, with Joe Manchin being probably the most powerful. He may be the Senate Majority Leader in a way. Um, how do you see this sorting out? I think the House, you probably can get it passed, but through the Senate might be more difficult. And how are you going to, maneuver that?
Yeah. Every major bill faces the parochial interests of every senator whose vote is needed. And, West Virginia has real concerns. It's one of the reasons why the support for the so-called energy veterans and the support of the utility workers of America and the support of the mine workers union could be very helpful here. A price on carbon creates very significant resources. The price on carbon that I've recommended is over $2 trillion in a decade. With money like that, you can go into the coal communities of West Virginia and put them back on their feet. And it's hard to find a way to do that without that kind of resources. So I think there's a way to do this. And, I think Joe has said over and over again that he's committed to solving the climate problem. And I think we just need to pull together and come up with the agreed program that everybody can get behind and that hits 1.5 degrees.
A couple of other good questions have come in. One is, what about the lobbying of the medical sector and big pharma? Is there any push there? And then the second question is, okay. Second question is, Senator Whitehouse, how can we health professionals be most helpful to you in getting strong climate measures enacted?
I think that continuing to tell the story of the health effects of climate change, the immediacy of it, what's happening now, is extremely important and valuable. And it's particularly important and valuable in states that have a Republican member of the Senate representing them. So to the extent you can get those stories out into the press, in front of those members of Congress, into the general conversation, that I think is extremely, extremely valuable. The opposition to getting something done on climate would like to characterize this as a liberal pipe dream that is designed to socialize and destroy the economy for the excuse of saving a bunch of polar bears who are probably going to be fine anyway. That's sort of the package of propaganda that they would like to emit about this. But when you're talking about what happens in Phoenix, well, that's not a great example because we don't have Republicans from there any longer. But when you're talking about what happens in a southern state, when the temperature gets beyond a certain point, and what it means for having to reassign the way firefighters and police officers respond to emergencies, what it means for the arrival of new parasites, new dangers, new diseases, what it means for the growth of, algae and the effect that that can have on people who are exposed to poisonous algae. All of those local stories really make a big difference. I remember going through the Carolinas and visiting with the most popular person on the who does the weather news. And he's a huge audience. And one day he said, you know what, I'm going to talk about climate change. And so the whole station went to DEFCON 4. They brought in extra security. And he started talking about climate change. And actually it turned out there was no real fuss. And he said that at the time, the most popular link that people click on his website is the link, what climate change means for poison ivy in my yard. So making it real and bringing it home to the gardener in their yard, to the child in the playground, to the fisherman on the water, that's the thing that I think really works. And health professionals have an enormous story to tell on the health side. So great question, and thank you.
Yeah, well, one thing Senator, that I would say that I've been talking about for the past 4 or 5 years is the health effects of climate change, giving talks all
Yeah.
over the country, and actually all over the world. And I think people, and this is one of the chat questions, is I think people need to hear more about the health consequences.
They
I mean,
do.
worry less about
And
the poison ivy, more about your
particularly,
health.
yeah, no, my point in the poison ivy example was that when it's
Yeah.
personal and near and close, people
Yeah.
really light up to it. When it's conceptual and far away and a vague, huge looming threat, it doesn't have the same impact. So whatever the local threat is in Idaho, whatever the local threat in Texas, whatever the local threat is in Mississippi or Alabama, that's the place where I think you get the most value out of focusing.
If I could put forth another question, we have several people who are interested in the price on carbon issues, and
Yep.
they mentioned that you've introduced a standalone carbon price bill, and they wonder whether you expect that price on carbon will be put into the omnibus bill that's expected to be introduced in several weeks.
Yes, we are rewriting it, updating it, and improving it as I speak. And in the next few weeks, we will refile it. And I do expect that a price on carbon will end up in the bill before we're done. First, because there's a lot of support for it in the Senate. The chairman of the Finance Committee, which has authority over that area, has announced that he is trying to pull together a price on carbon that the entire caucus can support. Our number 2 in the caucus, Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, has filed his own carbon pricing bill. Senator Coons, who's very close, is a Delawarean to President Biden, has filed a carbon pricing bill. We've got ours. There are a bunch of bills. And I think at the end of the day, if our target stays 1.5 degrees maximum global warming, it's very hard to get there if you haven't priced carbon. And the reason is very simple. The International Monetary Fund has calculated that the subsidy for fossil fuel in the United States alone is $600 billion every single year, which is a really hard hill for renewables and alternatives to have to climb. So you have to offset that with a price on carbon emissions in order to level the playing field for the other policies that you want to launch. And study after study shows that pricing carbon emissions is the most efficient and effective single intervention. And what we're going to need to do, because we've waited so long, is put together a whole portfolio of separate interventions that together point us to that 1.5 degrees. And I think it's highly likely that a price on carbon will be an element of that portfolio.
Right.
We also have one, thank you so much. These are just really such an excellent opportunity to hear from the foremost expert within the Senate, really. So we have another question here regarding mental health impacts of climate change. And Senator Durbin apparently is working on a piece of legislation that would promote community wellness and resilience and social cohesion as a trauma-informed community-level public health intervention using funds from SAMHSA. And some of it is being incorporated into a bill that is going to be sponsored by Senator Durbin. It's called the Rise to Trauma Act. And wonder if you know about that or have any reaction to it.
I don't know that the bill's been filed yet, but clearly there's a lot of evidence of the effect of climate change on behavioral and mental health. In some cases, particularly among young people who are going to have to live through this, the sense of dread at how we failed and what it might portend for them and for their children can put stress on them that has consequences in their lives. The heat can have consequences on people who have mental and behavioral health issues in terms of acting out under the stress of heat stresses. There are a considerable array of ways in which this happens. And then, of course, if you're using the climate opportunity to clean up some of the other pollution and environmental problems, then you're lifting the burden of stress off of those communities. And that obviously contributes to well-being in those communities. So it's a vector that isn't as well studied as, say, the lungs, but I think there's abundant evidence that it's a very important part of the equation, and we're trying to act on that as well.
Thank you. We have another excellent question here. Our organization is trying to talk about the opportunity to address the opportunities for health in addressing climate change, but also the threats of not solving the climate change problem. And do you have a reaction to what is the best balance in messaging for threat versus benefit? Threat versus benefit. What kind of response will we get?
Yeah, I think the president has focused on the economic value of the transition to renewable energy and to a clean, safe climate future. And I think that's probably the best entry point that there is. I think he's very well advised. He's got a lot of professional people who dedicate their lives to try to get the message right. So when he's focusing on jobs, I think that's probably the right focus. And it also blunts the false message of the climate deniers that fixing the problem will create economic harm. So that's the, to me, that's the best positive message. And I think the best negative message is also an economic one. And you can go to innumerable sources, Freddie Mac, the Bank of England, the US Fed, the insurance industry, and get these warnings about what's coming at us if we don't get ahead of this. This isn't just, the sea level comes up a little. This is the sea level comes up enough that there's a coastal property values crash throughout the entire country that is worse than the 2008 mortgage meltdown, or that there's a carbon bubble that pops in the world economy as the bottom suddenly falls out of the fossil fuel industry instead of in a controlled way. And there's nothing that says both of those can't happen and have an insurance company failure, as the insurance companies can no longer write insurance because they no longer can predict risk. All three of those separate risks could happen at the same time. And so I think focusing at this point on the economics, people are sensitive about their pocketbooks. People have lived through the 2008 mortgage meltdown. I think the positive and negatives in the economics need to be our lead message at this point.
That's very helpful. One other question that's a follow-on to that is, what do climate hesitant colleagues in the Senate hear in climate messaging, and where can we meet them, or how can we meet them where they are to move things forward?
That's a really good question. And the person who's best at that is a evangelical climate scientist from Texas, who was one of my witnesses. I go on climate trips to the red states, and she was a witness of mine in my Texas climate trip some years ago. And she's gotten more and more prominent to the point where she's just joined the Nature Conservancy as their lead scientist. Yes, somebody has used her name, Catherine Aho. Exactly. I think she's got a real genius for communicating this among conservative, evangelical, right-leaning, skeptical people. And so rather than try to recap her message, I just urge you to see her TED Talk. Talking about people's grandchildren makes a big difference. Keeping it local makes a big difference. There's some, she's got some very good advice. And of course, the Bible is filled with recommendations for how it's important that we take care of our, what Pope Francis calls our common home.
Great. I think that's all we have, Mona. I don't see any others for the senator. So I think we've kept you long enough. Thank you very much.
Well, let me just thank you, Nitin, for your friendship and help, and for your invitation here. Let me thank you all for your focus on this issue and for giving me this opportunity to share these thoughts with you. And please do keep the pressure on. And in any way you can amplify my message that corporate America has not showed up yet in Congress on this issue, I think that's the spur that can help drive them. And when they're driven, the Republican Party moves and everything begins to accelerate. So thank you all very kindly.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so
Excellent.
much.
Thank you.